In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Welcome to the Missing Dots. Today, we step into a name that has shaped Islamic history and shaken it. A name that unites millions, yet divides scholars even today. On the Missing Dots, we are pulling back the curtain on Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, his jurisprudence, and the Hanbali school that rose in his shadow. Did he protect Islam or fracture it? Was he a necessity of his time or the beginning of sectarian division? Did he open doors of knowledge or close them for centuries? Tonight, we ask the 100 taboo questions that Muslims, ex-Muslims, and critics have whispered for generations, and we answer them with evidence, scholarship, and historical honesty. Get ready, because today we unravel the entire narrative, thread by thread, dot by dot.
Yeah, and to really understand the sheer irony of this topic, you have to realize something right off the bat.
What's that?
The man whose name is now, basically synonymous with the absolute strictest, most aggressively state-enforced version of modern Islam. He was actually tortured almost to death.
Right. Literally tortured.
Exactly. And specifically because he believed the state had no right to enforce religion.
SubhanAllah. It really is wild when you frame it like that.
It is. And, we are confronting a massive mountain of source material today. I mean, centuries of theological treatises, modern demographic data,
And some really harsh critiques, right? Like from secularists and ex-Muslims.
Oh, absolutely. Rival schools, too. So we really need to strip away all the geopolitical noise of the 21st century.
Yeah, we have to look at the raw reality.
Right. We need to look at this man who changed the trajectory of the Islamic world basically from a solitary confinement cell in 9th century Baghdad.
The thing is, for anyone listening right now, you've almost certainly heard the word Hanbali thrown around like a weapon.
Oh, constantly.
Like it shows up in news articles about the Middle East. It totally dominates online debates. And honestly, it's constantly used as a shorthand for rigid, unyielding extremism.
Yeah, it really is.
But so much of that is just completely detached from the historical
And
reality.
entirely detached, yeah.
So reading through these loud critiques, the very first thing people point to, and this is the most common taboo question we found in our sources, is the accusation that Imam Ahmad essentially fractured the faith.
Right, the sect accusation.
Exactly. I mean, the Quran explicitly commands Muslims to remain united, right? So how do we justify having 4 different distinct schools of Sunni law?
Right.
Doesn't the very act of creating a specific named way inherently cause division?
Yeah, I hear that all the time. But that accusation, it fundamentally misunderstands the anatomy of Islamic law.
How so?
It assumes that any difference of opinion is a schism. We really have to draw a hard line right now between a theological sect, which in Arabic is a firqa,
Okay, a firqa.
right, and a legal methodology, which is a madhab. A firqa involves a violent or absolute split over, foundational theology or political legitimacy.
Or the Kharijites in early Islamic history, I guess.
Precisely. The Kharijites emerged in the 7th century, which was long before Ahmad was even born.
Right.
They broke away over political succession and instituted this extreme theology. They basically said anyone who committed a major sin was a non-believer.
Wow. Like an apostate.
Exactly. An apostate whose blood was permissible to shed. Now, that is a sect. That is a fracture that actually breaks the community apart.
Yeah, that's completely different.
And, the Sunni-Shia split is another example. That initially centered on the political succession after Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Those were massive schisms.
And those foundational earthquakes happened way before Ahmad ibn Hanbal entered the picture in 780 CE, right?
Long before. Centuries in some aspects.
Okay, so if a firqa is a sect that breaks the foundation, what exactly is a madhab? Because honestly, from the outside looking in, having 4 different schools, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi, and Hanbali.
Still looks like division, yeah.
Yeah, it looks like you've divided the religion into 4 different camps.
Think of a madhab not as a different religion, but as a different interpretive lens.
An interpretive lens, okay.
Right. The 4 canonical Sunni schools, they all agree on the core theology. They all agree on the aqidah, the creed.
So there's no debate on the big stuff.
None at all. There is no dispute about the oneness of God, the finality of the prophet, or, the obligation of prayer and charity.
Okay, so where do they actually differ?
It's entirely on the secondary practical legal rulings. The furu.
Ah, the application of the law.
Exactly. It is a methodological framework. It's how you derive law from the Quran and the Sunnah when you're facing completely new, unprecedented situations.
I was thinking about this when we were going through the sources. Tell me if this analogy holds up.
Sure.
It feels incredibly similar to, like, the United States Supreme Court.
Oh, that's interesting. How do you mean?
Well, you have 9 justices, and every single one of them reveres the exact same constitution, right?
Right.
But they have radically different jurisprudential philosophies. You have strict originalists who only care about the literal texts.
Like what it meant the exact day it was written?
Exactly. And then you have justices who view it as a living document. They rely heavily on historical precedent or broader societal context, maybe even pragmatic outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They aren't creating different countries. They aren't dividing the nation into sects. They are just using different intellectual tools to apply the same foundational text to problems the founders never explicitly wrote about.
Like internet privacy, yeah.
Yeah, or gene patenting, things that didn't exist back then.
That analogy actually maps perfectly onto the historical reality of the Islamic Empire in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember the empire was expanding at a breakneck pace. You had Muslims ruling over territories from Spain all the way to the borders of India.
That is a massive demographic shift.
Massive. And they were encountering complex new economic systems, ancient Persian bureaucratic structures, all sorts of new cultures.
So the old rulings didn't always neatly apply.
Right. The early jurists had to figure out how to apply a 7th century Arabian revelation to these wildly complex new realities.
Yeah. And Imam Ahmad was chronologically the final piece of that puzzle, wasn't he?
He was. I mean, first we had Abu Hanifa, who passed away in Kufa around 767 CE.
And Kufa was a very diverse, cosmopolitan city.
Exactly, it was a melting pot. He was dealing with really complex trade disputes, so his methodology naturally relied heavily on logical deduction and reason.
That makes sense.
Then you had Malik down in Medina, who anchored his rulings in the living, breathing tradition of the Prophet's actual city.
Right, relying on the practice of the people there.
Yeah. And after him came Al-Shafi'i, who tried to build a systematic bridge between reason and tradition.
And finally, we get Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Right, who died in 855 CE. He was the last of the four. But here is the critical detail that completely dismantles the accusation that he created a sect.
I'm listening.
He actively fought against the institutionalization of his own teachings.
Wait, really?
Yes, he fiercely opposed the concept of taqlid, which is the blind imitation of a scholar.
But wait, if he hated blind imitation, why do millions of people blindly imitate him today?
Because the institutionalization of the Hanbali school happened entirely posthumously. After he was gone,
Wow.
Ahmad's recorded instructions to his students were explicit. He literally told them, "Do not imitate me, nor Malik, nor al-Shafi, nor al-Thari, but take from where they took."
He wanted them to go straight to the primary source material.
Exactly. He viewed the elevation of a scholar's personal opinion to the level of divine law as genuinely dangerous.
So the guy who supposedly divided Islam into a fourth camp actually begged his students not to write down his personal opinions.
He did. The Hanbali madhab, as a formalized, systematized code of law, was actually constructed decades after his death
By who?
by students like Abu Bakr al-Khalal. Al-Khalal traveled extensively, collecting the thousands of verbal answers, the masal that Ahmad had given to specific questions during his life.
Oh, so he sort of aggregated all the Q&As?
Yes. He compiled them, categorized them, and built the architecture of the school. But you have to understand, in the classical era, this multiplicity of schools wasn't seen as a weakness.
It wasn't seen as dividing the religion.
Not at all. The concept of ikhtilaf, which means scholarly difference of opinion, was universally celebrated as a mercy.
A mercy. That's a beautiful way to look at it.
It was.
Yeah.
It gave this massive, diverse Muslim population legal flexibility while keeping them anchored to the exact same divine texts.
Okay, but I have a question here. If he was just this humble scholar teaching hadith in Baghdad, insisting people go back to the original sources,
Yeah.
why did his specific methodology crystallize into such an unyielding, rigid fortress?
I mean, you don't get a reputation for intense, uncompromising strictness by accident.
No, you don't. And to understand the rigidity of the Hanbali methodology, we have to look at the traumatic crucible in which it was forged.
The trauma.
Yes. You cannot understand Ahmad ibn Hanbal without understanding the Mina.
The Inquisition.
Exactly. The Inquisition. This is the exact moment where academic theory violently collides with state power.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Starting in 833 CE, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mamun launched a campaign to enforce a specific theological doctrine across the entire empire. And this was related to Greek philosophy, right?
Yes. The Caliph had heavily patronized the translation of Greek philosophical texts into Arabic, and he aligned the state with a rationalist theological school known as the Mutazilites.
Okay, the Mutazilites.
Yeah.
What was their main thing?
The core doctrine they wanted to enforce, and this is crucial, was the belief that the Quran was a created entity, brought into existence by God, rather than being the uncreated, eternal speech of God.
Okay, I have to pause here because I read through the secular critiques in our sources, and they look at this historical moment with total bewilderment.
I can imagine.
For a modern listener, debating whether the Quran is created or uncreated sounds like the ultimate ivory tower pedantry.
It does sound obscure to us today.
It sounds like medieval monks arguing over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Why would the most powerful political leader on earth, a man commanding vast armies and a massive treasury, care so deeply about a metaphysical technicality?
Right, to the point of instituting a brutal inquisition over it.
Exactly. Why?
Because it wasn't just about metaphysics. It was fundamentally about epistemology.
Meaning how we know what truth is?
Yes. It was about who holds the ultimate authority to interpret truth. Let's break down the political mechanics of this.
Okay, I'm with you.
If you believe the Quran is uncreated, it means the text is the eternal, transcendent, immutable word of God.
Right. It exists outside of time.
Exactly. It sits above time, it sits above space, and most importantly, it sits far above human reason and political authority.
So nobody can tamper with it.
Right. And the scholars who memorize, preserve, and transmit that uncreated word, they hold the ultimate moral authority in society. They are the guardians of the divine command.
Oh, I see. So the scholars were essentially a massive check on the absolute power of the caliph.
Exactly the opposite of what the state wanted.
Oh.
Now, flip the theology. If the state officially declares that the Quran is a created entity, then it is a product of time and space.
It's just a historical artifact.
Precisely. And if it's a created artifact, it is fully subject to human rationalization, interpretation, and adaptation.
And let me guess who gets to be the supreme, divinely appointed rational arbiter of the state.
The Caliph.
The caliph. Wow.
By forcing the religious class to declare the Quran created, Caliph al-Ma'mun was attempting to subordinate the religious scholars to state power.
He was trying to establish himself not just as the political executive, but as the supreme religious authority.
Yes, he was trying to take ownership of the truth.
SubhanAllah. When you frame it like that, the stakes become terrifyingly clear.
They really do.
Ahmad's refusal to agree wasn't just him being a stubborn, literalist theologian. He was an existential threat to the centralization of the empire.
He really was.
He was basically looking the most powerful man in the world in the eye and saying, you do not own the divine text. You cannot rewrite the rules using your Greek logic.
And as you might expect, the state responded to that defiance with horrific violence.
What did they actually do?
They required all judges, scholars, and religious officials to sign documents affirming the createdness of the Quran. If you refused, you were stripped of your position, your property was confiscated, and you were imprisoned.
So a total purge of the religious establishment.
Basically. And sadly, most of the religious establishment capitulated.
They just gave in.
Yeah. They justified it to themselves, signed the papers, and went home to protect their families. But Ahmad ibn Hanbal and a close companion named Muhammad ibn Nu flatly refused.
And the historical accounts of what happened next are incredibly visceral. I mean, Ahmad and Muhammad ibn Nu were arrested in Baghdad, placed in heavy iron chains.
Yes, and ordered to be transported across the desert to face the Caliph in Tarsus.
The journey was so brutal and the conditions so degrading that Muhammad ibn Nu actually died on the road.
He did. It was devastating. Ahmad was then brought back to Baghdad and thrown into a dungeon. He spent over 2 years in heavy chains, often in solitary confinement.
2 years in chains, just for refusing to sign a theological statement.
Yes, and the state subjected him to relentless interrogation by the sharpest Mutazilite philosophers of the time. They tried to debate him into submission.
But he wouldn't budge.
No. But the psychological torture eventually gave way to sheer, brutal, physical violence under the successor, Caliph al-Mutasim.
This is the part that is just hard to read.
It is. During the holy month of Ramadan, Ahmad was suspended and flogged by successive executioners. The historical texts describe him being beaten so severely that his flesh was literally torn open.
He repeatedly lost consciousness, right?
He did, and the caliph himself would step forward while Ahmad was bleeding out, offer him a cup of water to break his fast, and just beg him to say the words.
Just concede that the Quran was created and we'll stop.
Exactly. Just say it so they could stop the torture.
But he wouldn't. He just kept repeating the exact same phrase. Bring me a proof from the book of God or the sunnah of his messenger, and I will say it.
He demanded textual evidence, not philosophical logic.
And that defiance spanned the reigns of 3 different caliphs.
3 of them, yeah. But the state fundamentally miscalculated here.
How so?
They wanted to make a public, humiliating example of the most prominent traditionalist scholar in Baghdad. They wanted to prove the absolute supremacy of the state.
Right, to break his spirit so everyone else would fall in line.
But instead, they proved that state violence is entirely powerless against deep spiritual conviction. As news of his torture spread, the common people of Baghdad began to view him with almost mythical reverence.
He became a living symbol of resistance.
It's the ultimate backfire. When Caliph al-Mutawakkil finally came to power in 847 CE and officially ended the Inquisition, Ahmad was released.
The state had failed to break him.
Completely. He emerged from that prison cell not just as a scholar, but as an untouchable colossus of moral authority. He had successfully defended the independence of Islamic scholarship from political coercion.
But, that level of trauma doesn't just fade away.
No, it leaves a permanent mark.
You don't spend years being whipped in a dungeon by people using rational philosophy to justify your torture and then walk out with a positive view of rational philosophy.
Absolutely not.
This crucible of the Mina is the exact moment the Hanbali legal code hardens into a fortress, isn't it?
It is. It's the defining psychological and epistemological pivot of the school. The Mina convinced Ahmad and his loyal students that human reason, when untethered from divine revelation, is not just flawed. It is actively dangerous.
Because he had seen what logic can be used to justify.
Exactly. The Mutazilites had used sophisticated Greek logic to justify altering the nature of God's word and physically torturing those who disagreed. From that point forward, the Hanbali methodology was entirely reverse-engineered to protect the text from human manipulation.
Wow. Let's actually walk through how this methodology works in practice, because when we get into the 100 taboo questions from our sources, the sharpest critiques from rival schools and modern secularists attack this exact epistemological framework.
Right, the way they derive law.
Yeah. How does a classical Hanbali jurist actually solve a new legal problem?
Well, they use a strictly hierarchical, step-by-step filtration system.
Okay, take us through it.
Step 1 is universal across Islam. Is there an explicit, unambiguous command in the Quran or a completely authenticated, strong hadith from the Prophet?
If there is, the inquiry stops immediately. You just follow the text.
Exactly. No debate.
That makes perfect sense. No Muslim scholar of any school would argue with that.
Right. So, step 2. If the primary texts are silent or ambiguous on a specific issue, the Hanbali jurist looks to the fatwas, the legal opinions, of the companions of the Prophet.
Because these were the men and women who actually lived with him, right?
Yes. They understood the context of the revelation. If the companions had a consensus, that consensus is binding.
And if they disagreed among themselves?
Then the jurist must choose the opinion that aligns closest with the broader Quranic text, without introducing any new external logic.
Okay, still completely logical. You rely on the people who had direct access to the source. But step 3 is where the controversy explodes, isn't it?
Step 3 is the dividing line, yeah. If there is no clear text from the Prophet and no clear guidance from the companions, what do you do?
Most schools would use analogy, right?
Exactly. The Hanafi school, for example, would immediately pivot to Kiya's analogical reasoning. They would use their intellect to find an underlying legal cause in an existing rule and apply it to the new situation.
But the Hanbalis refused to do that.
The Hanbalis, following Ahmad's methodology, will deliberately choose to rely on a weak hadith over relying on their own human logic.
A weak hadith, meaning a historical report that has a known flaw in its chain of transmission.
Yes. Only if there is absolutely no weak hadith available will they grudgingly resort to Qiyas as an absolute desperate last resort.
I need to push back hard on this on behalf of the listener, because when you say it out loud, it sounds completely irrational.
I know it does.
You're telling me that if an empire of brilliant scholars is faced with a new legal dilemma, they will intentionally choose a historically dubious, broken game of telephone over sharp, deductive, peer-reviewed human reasoning.
That's one way to frame it, yes.
How is that not fundamentally anti-intellectual? It sounds like turning off your brain on purpose.
It looks anti-intellectual to a modern mind that basically worships rationality, but you have to view it through Ahmad's epistemological lens.
The trauma of the Inquisition.
Exactly. He didn't reject logic because he lacked intelligence. He rejected it because he recognized the inherent bias in human moral intuition.
He didn't trust us.
He recognized 1,200 years ago what modern psychology confirms today. Human beings are incredibly skilled at using logic to rationalize whatever outcome benefits them culturally, politically, or financially.
Right. Because he had literally seen the caliph use logic to justify centralizing power and torturing dissenters.
Precisely. For Ahmad, human reason is infinitely malleable and highly corruptible. The prophetic model, on the other hand, is tethered to divine truth.
Even if the transmission is a little weak.
Yes. Even a weak hadith is like a blurry, slightly fragmented photograph of the prophet's era. It's an attempt to capture divine intent. It is still grounded in the atmosphere of revelation.
While analogical reasoning relies entirely on the subjective mind of a 9th century jurist making connections.
Exactly. For a Hanbali, a blurry photograph of the truth is exponentially safer than a crystal-clear painting drawn by a politician's imagination.
Oh, wow. That actually frames it in a completely different light. He's building a system designed to survive human corruption.
That's the perfect way to describe it.
But this intense suspicion of human logic doesn't just stay in the realm of legal rulings. It bleeds directly into their theology, specifically regarding the attributes of God.
Yes, it does.
And this is where the secular and rival critiques in our sources get incredibly heated.
You were referring to the concept of anthropomorphism and the authority creed.
Yes. So when you read the Quran, it uses language that describes God having a hand or a face or sitting upon a throne. Now, the rationalist schools, the people leaning on Greek philosophy, look at that and say, obviously, God is a transcendent being. He is not a giant human sitting in the sky.
Of course not.
Therefore, these physical descriptions must be metaphors. The hand means his power or generosity. The throne means his absolute dominion. It's a very neat, logical way to resolve the tension.
It is very neat, but the Hanbali methodology absolutely refuses to play that metaphorical game.
They developed a theological doctrine called bila kaif, right?
Yes, bila kaif, which translates to without asking how.
I saw this term all over the historical treatises. How does it actually work in a real theological debate?
Well, when a classical Hanbali scholar reads the verse stating that God has a hand, their response is incredibly disciplined.
What do they say?
They say, we affirm that God has a hand, strictly because he used that word to describe himself, but we affirm it bila kaif without asking how.
So they don't try to picture it.
No. They say it is a hand unlike any human hand, it is not a physical limb, and we absolutely refuse to imagine its mechanics.
So they are walking a really tightrope here. They simultaneously reject the literal physical comparison to humans.
Which is a heresy called tashbih, yes.
Right. And they reject the rationalist attempt to turn it into a metaphor.
Exactly.
But by refusing to explain it as a metaphor, critics argue they are basically freezing the intellect. They are demanding that the brain accept a logical paradox and just stop thinking about it.
The Hanbali counterargument is that turning the attributes of God into metaphors is an act of staggering human arrogance.
Arrogance. Why?
Because to say the hand of God actually means his power implies that the human brain has successfully decoded the exact nature of the infinite creator.
Oh, I see. Like you're correcting God.
Yes. It implies you are correcting God's vocabulary to make it more palatable for a Greek philosophical framework. The Hanbali says, know your limits.
Accept the text, affirm its reality.
And recognize that the mechanics of the divine are fundamentally beyond human comprehension.
It's an enforced intellectual humility.
That's a great phrase for it.
But, building a fortress that relies heavily on textual literalism and views human logic with such deep suspicion brings us directly to the sharpest, most painful critiques in our stack of 100 taboo questions.
The science question.
Exactly. Because when you build a system that tells the intellect to step back, you eventually collide with the empirical scientific world.
And this is where the secular data points are brought forward as a weapon.
Right. The critics, particularly atheists and secular academics, look at the historical output of the Islamic world and ask a very brutal question.
If the Hanbali methodology is the purest, most authentic manifestation of Islam, why hasn't it produced major scientists?
Exactly. And the numbers in the sources are glaring. During the Islamic Golden Age, you had these towering polymaths, Ibn Sina, Al-Razi, Al-Biruni, Al-Khwarizmi.
Pioneering medicine, optics, algebra?
Yes, and none of them were Hanbalis.
No, they weren't.
And in the modern era, if you look at the Muslim scientists who have won Nobel Prizes, like Ahmed Zewail in chemistry or Abdus Salam in physics, none of them emerged from a traditional Hanbali educational framework.
That's true.
So the critics look at this and say, the proof is in the pudding. The Hanbali school is fundamentally anti-science and anti-progress.
Well, as impartial analysts, we have to deconstruct this accusation carefully.
Okay, let's deconstruct it.
First, the demographic argument relies on a massive correlation versus causation fallacy.
How so?
There is absolutely no peer-reviewed, authoritative demographic data that tracks the jurisprudential subsects of scientific innovators. The Nobel Committee does not ask its laureates if they pray according to the Shafi'i or Hanbali method.
That's a fair point. We don't actually have the hard data on everyone's personal madhab.
But more importantly, the critique fundamentally misunderstands what the Hanbali educational system was built to optimize.
Okay, if it wasn't built to produce physicists and chemists, what was it optimizing for?
It was optimizing for preservation. The Hanbali centers of learning in Baghdad, Damascus, and later the Najd were hyper-focused on the transmission of the prophetic tradition.
So they were basically historians.
Yes, they mastered the incredibly complex science of hadith verification, which is essentially a highly rigorous form of historical source criticism.
Right, verifying the chains of narration.
They mastered linguistics, grammar, and textual preservation. They view their role as the immune system of the religion.
Protecting the moral and spiritual DNA from being corrupted by foreign philosophies.
Exactly. They were not trying to invent the astrolabe or map the circulatory system.
It's like judging a world-class investigative historian because they haven't won a Pulitzer Prize in botanical science.
That's exactly what it's like.
Or screaming at a brilliant linguist because they haven't patented a new type of microchip. They're playing entirely different games on entirely different fields. You can't use the scorecard of natural philosophy to invalidate the discipline of historical preservation.
That is exactly the point. The Hanbali worldview creates a very strict, impenetrable firewall between the metaphysical world and the physical world.
Explain that firewall.
In matters of worship, theology, and the unseen, what is categorized as ibadat and aqidah, the door is slammed shut to human innovation.
Because the religion is complete, you cannot add to it.
Right. But in matters of the physical world, technology and social transactions, what they call mu'amalat, the actual Hanbali legal code is astonishingly open.
I found this part of the research genuinely surprising. The assumption is that because they are so strict in theology, they must ban everything in the modern world, but that's not true.
It is the exact opposite. The foundational legal maxim in Hanbali jurisprudence for worldly affairs is ibaha. Everything is permissible until proven forbidden.
So the default state of the physical world is completely halal.
Yes. Unless a jurist can produce a specific authenticated text from the Quran or the Prophet explicitly forbidding a new technology, a new medical procedure, or a new scientific pursuit, it is presumed entirely permissible.
So the madhab does not dictate the scientific method.
Not at all. It merely governs the moral and ethical boundaries within which the scientist operates.
That makes perfect sense, and we actually see historical evidence of this openness. I mean, look at one of the most famous Hanbali scholars, Ibn al-Qayyim, who lived in the 14th century.
Yes, he wrote extensively on medicine.
He did. He made remarkably advanced observations about psychosomatic illnesses, detailing how the health of the mind, emotional trauma, and spiritual distress directly manifest as physical ailments in the body.
That is cutting-edge psychological medicine for the 1300s.
And it was coming from one of the strictest Hanbali theologians in history.
And if you apply this to the modern geopolitical landscape, the data completely contradicts the anti-science narrative.
Yeah, I saw the numbers on the modern Gulf states.
Today, Hanbali majority nations in the Gulf region rank exceptionally high globally in patents per capita for highly specific applied sciences.
Like petrochemical engineering and advanced desalination technology.
Exactly, and renewable solar grids. The Hanbali legal framework doesn't suppress the engineering. It merely ensures the financial transactions funding the engineering are compliant with Islamic law.
So the accusation that the school is anti-science is a red herring.
Completely.
But what about the broader philosophical accusation, the taboo question of free thinking?
Right.
If I am a student embedded deeply in a classical Hanbali institution, am I allowed to use my brain to question the system, or am I just a robot memorizing tests?
We have to define free thinking very carefully within this cultural paradigm.
Okay, let's define it.
If by free thinking, a modern secularist means the fundamental right to publicly deconstruct the religion from the ground up, to doubt the existence of God, or question the authenticity of the prophet, or rewrite the foundational moral codes, then the answer is a definitive no.
Within this framework, that is classified as shak, right? Destructive doubt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the fortress walls are heavily fortified against it. The existential questions are considered permanently settled.
Right. You don't get to debate whether the house should exist.
But if by free thinking you mean the rigorous internal intellectual struggle to understand how the law works, to debate the historical validity of specific texts, or to fiercely argue with your peers over the application of a ruling,
Which is called talam, seeking knowledge.
yes, then it is not just allowed, it is mandatory. Imam Ahmad himself fielded and debated tens of thousands of complex queries from his students. The entire Hanbali tradition is marked by ferocious internal intellectual warfare.
Look at Ibn Taymiyyah, arguably the most influential Hanbali scholar after Ahmad himself.
Oh, absolutely. He spent his entire life in the 13th and 14th centuries writing massive, multi-volume refutations of the established political and religious dogmas of his own time.
He used the Hanbali methodology to tear down corrupt practices.
Yes.
So it's a highly constrained, highly focused freedom. You are inside the fortress. You cannot take a sledgehammer to the foundation, but you can rearrange the rooms, debate the architecture, and argue endlessly about how to defend the walls.
That is an incredibly accurate assessment of the classical school. But we can no longer delay the inevitable here.
We can't.
We cannot discuss the Hanbali school, its strictness, or its global reputation today without addressing the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Because the reason the word Hanbali evokes such visceral, explosive reactions in the 21st century has very little to do with 9th century debates about Greek philosophy.
No. It has everything to do with the 18th century, the 20th century, and the geopolitical realities of modern oil wealth.
It is time to talk about Wahhabism, the modern Saudi state, and how a methodology born in an abased torture chamber became the most aggressively exported religious ideology on the planet.
This requires absolute, strict historical neutrality from us.
Agreed. We are just looking at the facts.
The conflation of classical 9th century Hanbali fiqh with the 18th century Wahhabi reform movement is the epicenter of modern sectarian tension. We have to map exactly how one evolved or mutated, depending on who you ask, into the other.
Let's lay out the timeline. Imam Ahmad dies in 855 CE. For centuries, his school remains numerically the smallest of the four Sunni madhabs.
Right. It is highly respected for its piety and its preservation of hadith, but geographically it is mostly confined to scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and parts of Palestine.
Fast forward almost 1,000 years to the early 1700s, deep in the harsh deserts of the Najd region in the Arabian Peninsula, enter a fiery, puritanical scholar named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab.
Yes, sir.
What exactly did he do?
Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab looked around the Arabian Peninsula and saw a religious landscape that completely horrified him.
What was happening there?
He saw Muslims engaging in practices that had organically developed over centuries, venerating local saints, building shrines over graves, asking deceased righteous figures to intercede for them with God, and engaging in various mystical Sufi rituals.
Okay, and how did he react to that?
Abd al-Wahhab looked at these practices and declared them to be not just bit of heretical innovations, but outright shirk.
Polytheism, shirk. For our listeners who might not know, that is the heaviest, most dangerous word in the entire Islamic lexicon.
It absolutely is.
To accuse someone of shirk is to accuse them of associating partners with God, which effectively places them outside the fold of Islam.
Exactly. And Abd al-Wahhab heavily utilized the texts of classical Hanbali scholars, particularly the more severe rulings of Ibn Taymiyyah, to justify his theological purge.
He argued that he was simply returning to the pure, unadulterated methodology of Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
Right. He allied himself with a powerful local tribal leader named Muhammad ibn Saud. They forged a political religious pact.
And what was the deal?
Ibn Saud would provide the military force to conquer and unite the tribes, and Abd al-Wahhab would provide the religious legitimacy to purify the land of polytheism.
But hold on, if we look at the historical record, this is where mainstream Sunni scholars and classical Hanbalis fiercely push back against the Wahhabi narrative.
You absolutely do.
Because our sources make it very clear that the classical Hanbali jurists who lived long before Abd al-Wahhab did not universally declare these practices to be polytheism.
You have identified the core theological fracture right there.
Classical Hanbali titans like Ibn Qudama in the 13th century maintained an incredibly strict theology, yes.
But they allowed for practices like visiting graves, provided it didn't cross the line into actual worship of the deceased.
They understood the nuance between a layperson making a mistake out of ignorance and a layperson actively committing polytheism.
Exactly. Abd al-Wahhab, operating in the harsh environment of the desert, dramatically expanded the functional, everyday definition of shirk. You flatten the nuance.
So practices that classical Hanbalis viewed as mildly discouraged or sinful were suddenly elevated by Abd al-Wahhab to acts of apostasy.
Acts of apostasy that justified military action.
Wow. So he took the rigid chassis of the Hanbali methodology, stripped out centuries of scholarly nuance, and dropped a massive, highly aggressive, puritanical engine into it.
That's a really good way to put it. And honestly, this movement might have remained an isolated regional phenomenon forever contained in the Arabian desert if it weren't for the most consequential economic discovery of the 20th century.
Petrodollars.
The discovery of unimaginable oil wealth beneath the sands of Saudi Arabia completely inverted the historical balance of power within the Islamic world.
The scale of this is staggering. The demographic and financial data in our sources cite estimates that between 1975 and 2002, the modern Saudi state spent anywhere from $75 to $100 billion exporting their specific Wahhabi-influenced interpretation of Hanbali Islam across the globe.
It was an unprecedented geopolitical campaign of ideological export.
What did that actually look like on the ground?
Well, this money funded the construction of massive mosques in capital cities worldwide. It funded millions of free translated Qurans and theological texts.
And they set up scholarship programs, right?
Massive international scholarship programs, bringing thousands of young men from Indonesia, Nigeria, Pakistan, and the West to study in Riyadh and Medina, only to send them back home as fully trained clerics steeped in this specific, hyper-strict methodology.
And the practical result on the ground was massive cultural and religious disruption.
Oh, massive.
You had villages in West Africa or Southeast Asia that had been peacefully practicing a syncretic, Sufi-infused Maliki or Shafi form of Islam for 500 years.
Yes.
Suddenly, a well-funded, highly articulate, newly minted cleric arrives in the village, builds a beautiful new mosque, hands out free literature, and starts telling the locals that the way their grandparents prayed was borderline polytheism.
You can see immediately why this causes explosive sectarian friction at the local level.
It created an asymmetric reality where the historically smallest madhab suddenly had the loudest, best-funded megaphone in human history.
It completely homogenized the public perception of Islam. And it brings us to one of the most stunning historical paradoxes we could possibly uncover in this deep look into the sources.
I have been waiting to talk about this because the irony is almost physically painful.
It really is.
We started this entire discussion in a dark cell in 9th century Baghdad. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was flogged, chained, and physically broken because he absolutely categorically refused to allow the state to dictate religious truth.
He was the ultimate uncompromising champion of the idea that religion must be independent from political coercion.
And yet, through the alliance of Abd al-Wahhab and the House of Saud, the methodology bearing Ahmad's name eventually became the official, strictly enforced state religion of a modern geopolitical kingdom.
The ultimate defender against state coercion became the blueprint for a state-enforced religious apparatus.
It is a profound paradox.
It is, and it is a source of intense internal debate among modern traditionalist scholars today. Has the massive infusion of state power and petrodollars distorted the original humility and scholarly independence of Imam Ahmad?
That's a debate that isn't ending anytime soon.
No, it isn't. But to fully understand the current reality, we must shift our focus from macro geopolitics to the micro-level human impact.
We need to address those taboo questions regarding apostasy, conversion, and the psychological toll of this strictness.
Right, because the critics look at this black and white, highly rigid export of modern Hanbalism or Salafism, and they ask, is this driving people away?
Is the sheer, unyielding strictness causing a modern apostasy crisis among Muslim youth? When every minor infraction is heavily policed, do people just throw their hands up and leave?
We must rely strictly on the sociological data here, not anecdotal internet debates.
Okay, what does the data show?
The data shows no credible, large-scale correlation attributing apostasy rates specifically to a person's madhab affiliation or the strictness of their local mosque.
Wait, really? None?
None. When sociologists interview people who have left Islam in the 21st century, the drivers are almost always universal macro-philosophical crises.
Like what?
They leave because of the philosophical problem of evil. Why does God allow suffering? They leave due to the overwhelming influence of postmodernism and moral relativity.
Or perceived clashes with secular liberal human rights norms regarding gender or sexuality.
Exactly. They do not leave because they read a strict 9th century Hanbali manual on the precise mechanics of making ablution before prayer.
That makes a lot of sense. The crises of faith are happening at the foundation, not in the administrative details of the law.
Right. But the data reveal something even more fascinating on the other side of the equation.
What about the people joining the faith?
This is where the narrative completely flips.
Oh.
While critics assumed that the rigid strictness of the Hanbali-influenced Salafi movements would terrify modern people, it is statistically highly attractive to converts,
Especially in the West, right?
particularly in the hyper-liberalized West.
I have to admit, I initially found that counterintuitive.
How so?
Well, you would think someone raised in a liberal democracy with total personal freedom would seek out the most progressive, reformist version of Islam available. Why would they gravitate toward the strictest interpretation?
Because of the psychological exhaustion of modern life?
Exhaustion.
Yes. Many people converting to Islam in the West today are actively fleeing the moral relativity of postmodernism. They are exhausted by a society where truth is fluid, where morality changes based on social media consensus, and where every rule is negotiable.
They're looking for a firm, unmoving anchor.
Exactly. They want a clear moral compass without any ambiguous, wishy-washy compromises.
Alhamdulillah, that psychological dynamic is fascinating. The Hanbali methodology, with its absolute reliance on explicit texts, offers exactly that.
It says, here is the text, here is the rule. We do not apologize for it, we do not dilute it with modern philosophy, and we do not change it to fit the culture.
For a convert seeking structure in a deeply chaotic world, that level of theological certainty is profoundly comforting.
It is. The very rigidity that secular critics point to as the school's greatest flaw is, ironically, functioning as its most powerful beacon. It provides the absolute certainty of the divine text, insulated from human tampering.
So as we zoom out and look at the massive historical tapestry we've unrolled today,
It's quite a journey.
we started with a solitary man in an Abbasid prison cell enduring the lash to protect the uncreated Word of God.
Yes.
We traced how his trauma birthed an uncompromising legal methodology that viewed human logic with deep, justified suspicion. We saw how his students built a fortress of textual purity that prioritized preservation over scientific discovery.
And we watched as an 18th century desert reformer militarized that theology and how 20th century oil wealth projected it into every corner of the globe, disrupting centuries of tradition and sparking fierce modern debates.
If we synthesize this immense journey, the most crucial realization is this. Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal was never trying to build an empire.
He wasn't. He wasn't trying to create a massive geopolitical sect or dictate the foreign policy of a modern nation-state.
He was simply trying to build a fortress around the prophetic tradition.
He saw human reason as a fragile, corruptible tool, easily manipulated by men in power, and he sacrificed his own body to ensure that the divine text remained the ultimate, unalterable authority.
He was the anchor. While other early schools were confidently navigating the complex waters of Persian administration, Greek philosophy, and cultural integration, the Hanbali school dropped a massive iron anchor right into the sands of 7th century Medina and said, "We are not moving."
And yes, an anchor doesn't help you discover new continents. An anchor doesn't win you a Nobel Prize in applied physics.
But when the geopolitical storms hit, and when the ideological fashions of the day try to rewrite the religion, an anchor stops you from drifting into the rocks.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize his legacy. But as we close our analysis of the sources, we must leave our listeners with one final, deeply provocative thought to mull over.
Something that connects the 9th century directly to the screen they are looking at right now.
Let's hear it.
Wait, I think you have a thought, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Think about this. We live in an era where truth is constantly manufactured.
Right. It is manufactured by state media apparatuses. It is manufactured by invisible algorithmic forces on social media.
Exactly. It is driven by popular cultural consensus, and it is enforced by sheer financial power. We are under relentless pressure every single day to conform our beliefs to whatever the dominant narrative demands.
That is the defining struggle of the digital age.
So look back at the bleeding man in the Baghdad dungeon. Here was a scholar who allowed himself to be physically destroyed rather than publicly agree to a truth imposed by the powers that be.
His ultimate defining legacy wasn't actually a specific set of rules on how to pray or trade.
No. His ultimate legacy was total intellectual and spiritual defiance against state coercion.
The absolute refusal to bow to the manufactured narrative.
Yes. So the question we must ask looking at the modern landscape is this. If his greatest, most hard-won lesson was resisting the imposition of a state-manufactured truth, are the most rigid modern enforcers, Those who utilize vast state power, geopolitical leverage, and financial dominance to enforce a single uniform interpretation of Islam across the globe, are they actually missing the very essence of the man they claim to follow?
Subhanallah. That is a heavy, heavy question. If the fortress you build to protect the truth eventually becomes a prison enforced by the state, have you lost the spirit of Imam Ahmad? That is something you're going to have to think about for yourselves. May Allah grant us success. Come on, let's go. Don't forget to follow this channel, The Missing Dots. Thank you.